All right, so if you'll open up to Acts 25, if you remember from the last time we were together, we got to see that Paul concluded his time in Caesarea by being put in prison for 2 years under Felix. Felix's own wife Drusilla, of course, also the sister of Herod Agrippa II. Felix just left him there, hoping that at some point maybe he would offer some money to him to be set free. And of course, Paul never did that. And in doing that, he's protected from the Jewish constituency that was definitely vengeful against Paul, even setting up plans to kill him multiple times. And so then, finally, at the end of those 2 years, Festus becomes the governor over Judea. And as soon as Festus comes into office, it doesn't take but a few days, and the Jews come before Festus to say, we've got to deal with Paul. Of course, they wanted to kill him. They wanted to have Festus bring him down to Jerusalem so that they could kill him on the way, and yet that's not going to happen. Because Festus, whether he knew it or not, says, I'm not going to be in Jerusalem very long anyway. He says, I'm going back to Caesarea. We can have this up there. So, as those things unfold, then Festus figures out exactly who Paul is and what's going on, but he has no idea, even after he's appealed to Caesar, what am I going to say about him? I mean, here are the charges, but there's really not anything that an emperor or a Caesar would care about. It's not anything that's political. It's not anything that's military. It's people who are having a disagreement over what their old covenant says and teaches. And so you almost kind of wonder, it's like having a kid that's in jail and going, why are you in jail? Well, me and my sister had a fight about whose toy it really was. And you go, well, how am I going to take that before the judge? Now, the things of Jesus are much larger matters, but on the political scale, that really wasn't their concern. It's not a military uprising. And to go, what am I going to do with this? Now, he's a Roman citizen. He has a right to appeal to Caesar. And yet, in doing it, you see what lays out. And so, here's Festus, his own brother, the king, or not brother, but his own, not even relative. But Herod Agrippa comes, and his sister/wife, Bernice, is there. And so to go, how about another opinion here? Maybe you can tell me. You're the king. Maybe you can give me something that I can send to Caesar. So, if you notice Acts 25, look at verse 23. So on the next day when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp and entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. What does that tell you about kind of the setting of the day? Just looking at verse 23. Organized? It's a big deal, right? I mean, you almost kind of imagine the way it talks about it. Amid great pomp, I mean, that's kind of a quick way to say it. It's like, you almost wonder, was there music playing in the background as they came in? They're wearing the festival robes. Everything is kind of at the high hilt of those kind of endeavors. And yet here they all are, and they're there to just be able to hear from Paul and these charges and to figure out, what are we going to send to Caesar? So here they are, commanders are there, prominent men of the city. I mean, really another aspect of this is not just a four-person quorum. I mean, to think prominent men of the city of Caesarea. You have the king there, which when the king shows up, a lot of other people want to show up. To also see the commanders are there. So kind of a flex of the military here. And then to go, and they're all gathered together, and then Paul's brought in. Verse 24. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. And just notice where he starts. He says, you almost kind of think in terms of, it's almost like, all right, now that we're all here, this is what we're here for. Everybody in Jerusalem, all the Jews, even here in Caesarea, he says, they all want to know, and they loudly declared, Paul should die. Well, if you think in terms of being in a courtroom, whenever capital punishment is being discussed, it's usually pretty quiet. Because you realize a court does have authority to do that. Here they are gathered together. He says, they've appealed to me, and they said he should not live any longer. Verse 25. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. He says, this is what the Jewish people say, he shouldn't live any longer. He says, but I've made a different declaration. He says, I decided there's nothing here that's worthy of death. Now, you realize as a governor, Agrippa being the king, this is one of those statements of, and keep in mind in chapter 25, Agrippa and Festus have talked about these things before, so this is not like the opening of this case. But to go, I've made a statement. Prominent men are there, commanders are there, to go, I know what the people wanted. I'm not doing what the people wanted. And realize there were far more Jews that were not for Christ in Caesarea and Jerusalem than there were those who were followers of Christ. So for a governor to do something that is not helpful to the majority of the people tells you a little something. And you realize here, he says, I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. And he's already appealed to the emperor. And you'll see these words kind of get used interchangeably. Emperor, Caesar. Here in a minute, he's going to call him Lord. And so just know that he's talking about the same person. But then, continue on and says, so I decided to send him. He says, I'm going to send him to the Caesar, to the emperor, just the way that he said. He appealed to Caesar. Then, verse 26. Here's kind of the conundrum that Festus is in. And really, this is the whole purpose for this gathering, which kind of tells you what you should be looking for as we go through chapter 26. He says, yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. Now there's the term Lord. That's how he sees Caesar. He says, I'm in submission to him. I'm going to send him to Caesar. I don't have anything definite to even write down. Now, he says, therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. He says, I want to have something to write down. Now, I want you to think back earlier in the book of Acts. If you remember back to chapter 23, whenever the commander, Claudius Lysias, is going to send Paul up to Felix in Caesarea on that night whenever he learned about the plot to kill Paul. If you look in Acts 23, kind of verses really 26 through 30, that's the letter that Claudius Lysias, the commander, sent. There's a little bit of the type of information that goes with a prisoner. This is why he's coming to you. I mean, it's not as if they could go, what does the internet say about this? And what's my email say about this? I'm going, okay, well, here's the letter. Festus is looking for something to write down. I don't know about a length, but something similar to where I can communicate what's going on so that we kind of get to the bottom of this before I send him to Rome. Because otherwise, Caesar's going to have to go, well, let's send down to Jerusalem and Caesarea and figure out what this is all about. And just time keeps on marching on. So, of course, this is his plan. He says, I want to have something to write. Then verse 27, for it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. He says, that just sounds crazy. That'd just be absurd to send him and not say anything about what's going on or a reason why. So, chapter 26 opens up, and Agrippa, which I want you to kind of notice. If you notice in chapter 25, verse 24, who's speaking? Festus is. And he speaks through the end of chapter 25. When you get to chapter 26, notice who's speaking. Now the king's going to take over. And he's going to pose a statement here. He says, Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. He says, just tell us. Now, I want you to think of Paul here just for a moment. Here's Paul, a Jew, a Pharisee of Pharisees, converted to Christ, standing before a king and governor, and you've just been told you're permitted to speak for yourself. And I've already appealed to Caesar. I already know why I'm here because I was just told by the governor. They want to have something to write down about the charges, about why I'm here. I already know that I'm headed to Rome because that's where he's already said I can go. That's what Paul already knows. And then you come to this moment where you're going to speak before the king. I mean, if you think in terms of a parallel for today, if you can imagine standing before the governor who appeals to probably somebody we would think along the lines of a president, who is then going to take you before the United Nations. I mean, somebody who's higher than the president. Higher, because there's somebody who's higher than the king here, and that's Caesar. You imagine being able to give and speak for yourself before the governor, before the king, knowing that you are on pace to be before the Roman Caesar. You think you might have a few butterflies? Now, I want you to know that it doesn't appear to be that way with Paul. But I want to take you back in time a little bit to think about this moment. Now, go back to Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. This is the first telling of Saul's encountering Christ. And he's already encountered him on the road. He's already been struck blind. And then comes Ananias, faithful Ananias. And he says, Ananias asks some questions about, are you sure this is the guy you want me to go? He doesn't say it that way, but in verses 13 and 14, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he did to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, this is verse 15, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. He says, for I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. What did Jesus already know way back here in Acts 9? Jesus knows this man is going to go before kings. He's going to go before Jews and Gentiles. But even to say to go before kings. And it's been a while. It's not as if this is just a decade before what we're reading about over in Acts 26. I mean, think about that. Whenever we were converted to Christ, whenever we were baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of our sins and received the gift of the Holy Spirit, you ever imagine the Lord already knowing the things that we're going to encounter before that moment took place? And to prepare you for that? Not to just have us dropped into situations, but to prepare us for those interactions. I mean, these are things that Jesus was talking about way back here to Ananias before Saul has even been converted. Saul's still blind over at Judas's house in Damascus on Straight Street. I mean, all these details that are given. The aspect that we really need to grasp is, how deeply does Jesus know our lives? And how far in advance does he know what's coming? It's so far beyond what we grasp. And yet to prepare us. Because I want to show you a promise that goes way back even further. Look back at Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21. Look at verse 10. Right before here, there's the widow, the poor widow that comes and brings in her 2 small copper coins, and Jesus tells those who are around him, after seeing these others put in all this money, he says she gave more than what all they did put together. And for the apostles, that was kind of a breathtaking moment of like, what do you mean? How can that be? And the idea is, she gave all that she had. You think, to give everything was just amazing. Then, as they're standing there in the temple, they look around and they go, man, this is a really ornate looking place. How beautiful are these stones? And Jesus makes a statement as they're leaving the temple, and he says, there's coming a time when not one of these stones is going to be left standing upon top of each other. What? You can imagine they're kind of taken back at that. And they get over to the Mount of Olives, and I think it's Mark's account actually tells you that it's Peter, Andrew, James, and John who are talking to Jesus for this conversation. And they want to know, when's that going to happen? When's this judgment coming on Jerusalem? And as part of that conversation, I want you to look here in Luke 21. Just look down at verse 10. It says, then he continued, Jesus continued by saying to them, nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes and in various places, plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. He says, all these things are coming, and these are about the judgment that's going to come upon Jerusalem. It's not about the end of time. Verse 12. He says, but before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. Here he is talking to the apostles. Think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John. What's going to happen to James? He's going to be beheaded by Herod. You think about, there you go. There's Herod Agrippa the First. Then you think about Peter's going to be put in a similar predicament, except for God is going to deliver Peter. He'll be able to live, to continue to teach. But if you notice it here, here's where Jesus is making these statements. He says, before all these things happen in terms of the destruction of Jerusalem, he says they're going to lay their hands on you and they're going to persecute you. Think about for Peter, Andrew, and John, and as well as James at the time, they were all scourged for the sake of the name of preaching and teaching about Jesus. So you look at these things and go, all right. He says, they will lay their hands on you, persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons. Now, who was the one who delivered a lot of people to prison? Saul, who later on becomes Paul. Isn't it interesting to think the very person who's going to be working against them will at one point, after his conversion, be the one who's working together with the Lord? Now, he doesn't tell them all that, but you see the point. He says, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. And then now you see Paul coming before governors and kings. Then, he says, for my name's sake. Verse 13, it will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. Now, what are those apostles supposed to testify about? About Jesus. It's not about self, like here's my story. It's about here's how Jesus is the King. Here's how Jesus is the Savior. Here's how Jesus overcame sin. He says they had to be with Jesus since the time of John's baptism, all the way up until his death, even resurrection and seeing his ascension, which is so wonderful because this conversation takes place at the exact same place that Jesus ascends. So, he says, it'll lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So you think about, here's Paul standing before Agrippa going, what an opportunity. Then verse 14. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves. For I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. He says, don't make it about you. Don't make it about your thinking. He says, I will give you utterance and wisdom. Who's the I? Jesus. He says, I'm going to give it. Later on, he's going to give them a promise about the Spirit that's going to help them, the apostles, not us in this sense, to be able to remember everything that Jesus had taught them, to guide them into all truth. Then, if you notice the aspect of this, to go, I'll give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. If you remember way back in Acts earlier, whenever Peter and John go before the Sanhedrin and they start talking, do you remember what the reaction of the Sanhedrin is? Man, we can't refute these guys. They're untrained and unlearned, but we can't refute what they're saying. Guess who was giving the words? Jesus was. And you think, what a beautiful thing to stand in that moment and to be able to bear witness about Jesus and go, this is not what I would have thought of. This is sure working a whole lot better. And to go, Jesus is doing exactly what he promised he would do. Now, notice this, verse 16. He says, but you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Now, think about that. He says, there's some folks that you may love dearly, but you won't be able to trust. Then, he says, they'll put some of you to death. 17, you will be hated by all because of my name. I mean, can you imagine hearing that? Everybody's going to hate you. Whoa. He says, you're not here to be liked. Oh, okay. That'd be kind of hard to hear. Then the next statement, yet not a hair of your head will perish. Now, is he talking about physically? No, because what's going to happen to James? He's going to be beheaded. And you think about that and go, yet are they going to be preserved in life? Spiritually. Certainly. Certainly. He says, by your endurance you will gain your lives. What if you give up? You'll lose your life. Spiritually as well as maybe even physically. But you think about, you're going to have to endure and keep going. Now, you see these promises. Come back over to Acts chapter 26. So you think about the similar things. Here's Paul before governor, before king, before prominent men of the city. He knows, you know what, I'm going to be hated. That's okay. I don't mind. Then he gets this opportunity. He says, you're permitted to speak for yourself. Back at Acts 26, verse 1. Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. And his defense is going to go verse 2 all the way down through verse 23. And then it's going to turn into a conversation again. He says, this is my defense. And this is what he's going to tell them. Now remember, he knows they want something to write down to send to Caesar. He knows that he's headed to Caesar. He knows that he's already been in prison for a little more than 2 years. And now comes his opportunity. And yet to see with honor he comes before the king. He doesn't say, King, I see that you have an incessant relationship with your sister. Self-control. Sometimes we go around picking fights that don't matter in the moment. We need to be more wise than that. And remember, here's a promise to the apostles. I'll give you what you need to say. Now, verse 2. Paul says, in regard to all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today. He says, I recognize there's all kinds of accusations against me, but I am actually thankful to be able to stand before you. There's something about standing before somebody with authority that lets you know, man, it's time to put it right here. Verse 3. Here's why he feels that way. Especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. Here's why. You understand the Jewish things. If you remember, Herod Agrippa II and Bernice's sister, Drusilla, remember what it said about her? She's a Jewess. If you want to look back at it real quick, you can see it back in chapter 24, about the way that she gets introduced whenever she comes. Acts 24:24. But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess. And if you remember, Drusilla and Bernice and Herod Agrippa II are all siblings. So, to go, she was a Jewess, so what does that mean that he had to be? Somehow related to Jews. And he says, no wonder that he would be appointed as governor. You better know what the people are thinking if you're going to be able to govern. So he says, I'm so fortunate to be here before you. And he says, you're an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Now, I want you to think about that. You're acquainted with all the questions. What was another word you probably use for that? Controversial things. You understand what's going on here. We would say, you understand the climate of the situation. But that's just our words. He says, therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. I need your patience. He says, I beg for your patience. This is going to take a minute or two. And if we were to read down through these verses, you'd realize it doesn't take a whole lot of time to read these things. You're really talking about 5 minutes maybe at the most if you really take your time and go through them. But he says, just be patient with me. I'm going to lay it out in front of you. And I understand that you're very well acquainted with all the customs and all the controversial things going on in Judea. Verse 4. So then, all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Since they have known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. He says, you can ask any of the Jews. I want you to think about that. Because that is a true, genuine statement. If they hated Paul or if they liked Paul, everybody knew about his upbringing. You think in terms of, he even describes himself, I was ahead of my own contemporaries. He says, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. In other words, he was really kind of climbing up the ladder, spiritually speaking, according to the Jews, that he would be a rabbi. He'd be the kind of man that people would go to and ask, how should we live? And studied at the feet of Gamaliel, I mean, top-tiered teacher of the time, that he would have to invite you to his school. You didn't get to apply. And to go, everybody knew about Saul. I mean, his conversion was shocking to everybody. Those who are of the strictest sect of the Pharisees says, can you believe what happened to Saul? What happened to him? He must be out of his mind. For those who were the saints, they saw his conversion, they went, can you believe that the Lord's grace can turn somebody even like that? And you go, he's well known. And he says, you can ask all the Jews. They know my manner of life from my youth up. He says, beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. I mean, to live away from home at a young age, quite a different picture. Then verse 5 says, since they have known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify, he says, if you can find anybody who's willing to come into the court and say something, they'll all tell you the same thing. Which is something, because they could have asked any of them, and they all would have said the same thing. Now, even those who are seeking to kill him now. Says, do you know that Paul was a man that, well, he used to go by the name of Saul, but yeah, we know that. Then, he says, I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. And you think about Pharisees, just think, we're not going to go through, you can go back and look in Matthew chapter 23 about the different woes that Jesus gives to the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites. I mean, the Pharisees were so strict that they would count out leaves of mint to go. They'd count them, and every 10th one, they would set it in a different pile to be part of their tithe. Now, they neglected big things like justice and mercy and compassion and things like that. But to go, you know what? They were so strict. They would go through these things. They would make sure with the washings. Remember how they washed their hands, ceremonially? It wasn't something that actually took away any dirt. It was just kind of a ceremony. They'd do it for every meal. You go, man, just strictness. But it had all been severed from who? From God and from Jesus. Karen.
They're the true example of legalism and no heart.
Right. Completely. And so and Jesus brings that up in Matthew 15, and he talks about the washings aspect. So, realize this is where Saul comes from. And this is his background, and everybody will tell you the same thing. If you want witnesses, just go ask any Jew. They'll tell you the same thing. Then, continuing on, verse 6. He says, and now I'm standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. He says, here's why I'm on trial. And remember, what's Festus and Agrippa looking for? Something to write down. So Paul makes it easy. I'll tell you why I'm here. It may not be what you think is important. He says, but I'm standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. He says, God made a promise. And I want you to realize what he's going to bring up is the aspect of this promise. Now, you can look back earlier in the book, like in Acts chapter 13, it's going to talk about a king. It's going to talk about those aspects. But that's not what he's going to bring up here, because it's going to be different. Verse 7. The promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God night and day. As for this hope, O king, I am being accused by Jews. Now, he's talking about to you, he says, the 12 tribes. He says, hope to attain this. He says, and keep in mind, Paul is of the tribe. Do you remember what tribe Paul is of? Benjamin, which ironically was the smallest tribe, most insignificant. And that's really kind of what Paul means. It means something of insignificance. What a name to choose. Then he says, He says, they were hoping to attain, he says, as they earnestly serve God night and day. He says, our 12 tribes, and you think about, what's he saying? He's not talking about long, long time ago. What's he talking about? He's talking about the present. He says, because if you notice the way he talks about it, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain.
He's including the king and all his people in there.
Right.
Isn't this a little bit of a brilliant strategy?
Yeah.
It seems to me like Paul is saying, you believe this promise.
Right.
I do.
And whose words are really coming through here?
God.
Here's Jesus. I mean, here's the strategy. Let Jesus say it, and we'll just be the mouthpiece, right? How often do we need to think that same way when people ask questions? I'm amazed at times somebody asks a question. They say, what do you think about this? Let's read these verses. Let's see. Let's let him be the one to answer the question. Because whenever it turns to opinions, what happens? Well, that's just the way you see it. Here's what we got to deal with. And to go, this is exactly what Paul's doing. Notice how he continues. He says, as they earnestly serve God night and day, and for this hope, O king, I'm being accused by Jews. He says, and this is the hope, this is the promise that has gotten me into this predicament. Notice what he's been talking about all along. Look at verse 8, because this is what it's really all about. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead? What's this whole controversy about? Resurrection. Doesn't all of Israel hope to attain to a resurrection? Now, I want you to realize there are some exceptions here. There's just so happens to be a whole sect of people who don't believe in a resurrection. What do you call them? Sadducees. So here's all these Sadducees. They don't believe in resurrection. They don't believe in angels. Don't believe in spirits. And you go, look at how they've cut themselves off. Now, what you kind of see through the point. Do you have something you wanted to add, Tiffany?
I was just saying an antichrist too.
Right. So you look at what's going on here to see, all right, why is it considered credible among you? I want you to think about that question just for a minute. And I want you to understand how wonderful that is. Whenever we come to faith about the resurrection of Jesus, it completely changes the way you think about that question. But for Agrippa, for Festus, for all the others that are there, to go, what do you think about resurrection? I mean, that's really what's being posed in front. What do you think about resurrection? Well, I know Jesus raised from the dead, but for them, man, we've heard about that Jesus raised from the dead. We're just not quite sure what to do with that. And you go, okay. Then he continues on. Verse 9. He poses the question to kind of heighten the awareness. Verse 9. So then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. He says, let me tell you where I was on this. I was sure that I had to oppose those who are working in the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Verse 10. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons. Isn't it interesting that he calls them saints? He doesn't just say, well, those people who believed. And he says, people who are set apart as holy. Not common anymore. And do you think that's how the Pharisees really thought about him? No. But do you see the kind of language he's using? He's using language that shows there's been a change of heart. I'm telling you about what things really were and where I was off on this. So, he says, not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, as well as the high priest, if you go back and read it, he says, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. Now, some people take this thought and go, maybe Saul was on the Sanhedrin. Maybe he was. But either way, what's he telling you? He approved of their death. And at the same time to go, what did he think about Jesus and those that followed him originally? He thought they were dead wrong. And if you couldn't get them killed, maybe at least you'd get them locked up. Now, he says, I did it in Jerusalem. I mean, you think about headquarters city for Judaism. And so, notice how he continues, verse 11. And as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. I mean, did he take this lightly? I mean, was he just going through the motions and doing this stuff? Let's use this terminology. Maybe it's he's enraged. Is he emotionally invested in this? I mean, to the point of rage. He says, I let this anger, and for him, he wouldn't call it that. He would have used a term like religious zeal. I wanted to make sure that nobody was bringing in anything opposite of our God. So he didn't recognize who Jesus was and what he did at the time. He says, man, I punished them. I went to their synagogues. And this is exactly what Jesus told Peter, Andrew, James, and John would happen. And so whenever those things did happen, it gave them a renewed conviction in what Jesus had shared with them. Because it's something whenever people tell you things, and at the time you might go, is that really the way it is? And then you see it unfold in front of you and you go, everything he said is the way it is. Not just those few things. Then, he says, furiously enraged at them. I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. Verse 12. Now you're going to see him talk about the question that's kind of bouncing in between the ears of the listeners. I thought you were here for the resurrection of Jesus. Why are you telling us that this is where you came out of? Like you wanted to kill all the people who are like this. It sounds like you wanted to kill all the people who are like you are now. How can that be? Can you imagine the perplexion of those that were listening? Whether they knew much about this or not, to go, how do you go from this extreme to this extreme? What happened in between here? And so, what's he going to tell them? Exactly what Jesus wants them to tell them. Verse 12. While so enraged as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. Now think about it. I had authority to go do this. Verse 13. At midday, O king, and talking about King Agrippa, he says, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. I just want you to think about the way he uses to describe it. A light that was what? What do you know of that is brighter than the sun? I mean, I want you to think, this has to be something beyond just the earthly realm. I mean, isn't the sun's brightness kind of what we compare things to on the earthly realm? And Paul says, even brighter than the sun. And shining all around him. And the others could see it. The others could see it as well. So you go, there's some witnesses if you're looking for them. You can ask them too. So do you see where Paul brings Agrippa? Brighter than the sun. What in the world are you talking about? Then, he continues on. He says, and those who were journeying with me, they saw it too. Verse 14. And when we had all fallen to the ground, what kind of effect did that light have on them? I mean, you realize, here they are, and they all fall to the ground. You think they've just, oh, that's just amazing. It doesn't just say that they were bewildered or that they were amazed. I mean, it's to the point that it was so impactful that they fell to the ground. Then, He says, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect. And if you add up all the stories, the 3 times that Saul's conversion is talked about in the book of Acts, you'll realize this is kind of the missing piece, that it's spoken in a Hebrew dialect. The people that traveled with Saul at this point don't understand the Hebrew dialect. They're Hellenistic folks. They only understood Greek. They heard a voice, but they didn't understand what it was saying. Maybe in the same sense of if someone spoke German and you don't know German, well, you hear a voice, but you don't know what's being said. Well, to them, this is the way that Jesus is talking. And you think, and to think of Jesus talking to Saul in a language that he can understand, which tells you this message is not for everyone who's there. This is for him. The message of Jesus is for everyone who's there. But this is just about Saul and Jesus. Then, he says, Jesus saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Which also tells you how personal is Jesus in these persecutions. Very. In the same sense as whenever something happens to your children or grandchildren, it's not like, well, that's just my family. You're like, no, this has a deep effect on me. And to go here, he says, why are you persecuting me? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting my people? He says, why are you persecuting me? He says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, if you don't know what goads are, it's kind of a tool that shepherds would use. And the idea is to have a bit of a club-looking apparatus, and on the end it might have thorns on it or nails driven through it or something to where whenever the sheep goes the wrong way and they're being rebellious or stubborn, you would take it and you'd whack them with it. And they would go, oh, I guess I need to go back this direction. Now, that may sound harsh, but whenever animals or even people here get so stubborn, man, they got to get whacked hard. And I'm not talking about us going around to clubs, but to go, here's Jesus putting it in a language that Saul understands. He says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. And to go, and I'm going to keep on hitting you. And realize he's going to be blind for 3 days after this. He's going to have plenty of time to do some thinking. And he's going to spend a lot of time praying from other accounts back in Acts chapter 9. But notice, he says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Verse 15. And I said, who are you, Lord? Now you notice, right off the bat, Saul understands, I know I need to submit. You are the Lord and not me. Who are you? Who am I talking to? He doesn't immediately make the connection. Oh, this is about the followers of Jesus. Andrea.
With the comma there, does it make it more like, who are you, Lord?
Yeah, it definitely does. Who are you, Lord? The submission aspect. And the Lord said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. He says, that's who you're talking to. Now, think about this. From Agrippa's point of view, remember what the question, Paul said, I'm on trial here for the hope and the promise of the resurrection. And you know that Jesus was killed, crucified. I mean, every Roman would know that, especially a governor or a king of Judea. And to go, oh, I know he died, and I'm telling you that Jesus talked to me after that. So what does that have to say about resurrection? He's alive. He may not be alive on earth, but he's alive. Now, so he continues. You understand why these things are getting brought up. And you think about, to speak the words that Jesus was going to give them, and Jesus talks about a conversation that he had with Saul. Now, here, he says, verse 16, continuing the same statement. He says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting, verse 16, but get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things in which I will appear to you. How's that for a thought? There's going to be more? Now, he says, get up and stand up on your feet. I know you're on the ground. And then to make the next statement, he says, there's a purpose that I'm here to talk to you, to make you a minister, a servant. He says, and a witness, to tell others. And it just so happens, he's there in the court. He's there in this great assembly and making these statements about exactly what Jesus had said to him. Then, there's your witness aspect. He says, but also to the things which I will appear to you, verse 17, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to rescue you. You think Paul was keenly aware that God had rescued him? I mean, in terms of being taken away from Jerusalem up to Caesarea to be protected from those more than 40 men who had given that vow that they wouldn't eat or drink until Paul was dead. Then, whenever they wanted him to be called away from Caesarea to go back down to Jerusalem so they could kill him now 2 years later. I mean, Paul understands these things that Jesus told him way back there on the road to Damascus. He now understands them. Rescuing you from the Jewish people, and if you notice, Jewish might be in italics. If you notice the way that the Jews are thought about, rescuing you from the people and from the Gentiles. Well, you're either Jew or Gentile, so you know what's imposed there. He says, to whom I am sending you. So was Jesus going to send Paul just to the Jews or just to the Gentiles? Nope. Witness for all. Verse 18, here's the point. To open their eyes so that you may turn from darkness to light and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. Now, these details that are given here in Acts 26 are far more details in terms of conversation than you get in the previous tellings of Saul's conversion. And I think you understand why. He says, here's what's at hand. It also tells you a little bit more about what Saul would have been thinking about for those 3 days that he was without sight. Going to make you a minister. Going to take you to the Jews and the Gentiles. Gentiles? What do you think Pharisees thought about Gentiles? Dirt. That might be a good way to say it. And to go, what? Then, in terms of the other things, to open their eyes. Now, think about that one. Whenever you're blind, and the words you heard from Jesus are about opening someone's eyes, what are you praying for? What you might be wondering, are my eyes ever going to be opened? How am I going to be a witness if I can't see? If you remember, while he was praying over the course of those 3 days, he saw a vision about a man by the name of Ananias coming in and laying his hands on him and giving him his sight back. You think about, usually whenever blind people who've been blind from birth dream, they dream in terms of just audio, sounds. He says, here's somebody who had seen, and now he's seeing this vision, and to go, and I'm going to be telling this? He says, wow. He says, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light. He says, and from the dominion of Satan to God. Do you think Saul thought he was of the dominion of Satan? Not at the time. But over the course of those 3 days, he had some thinking to do. He says, and to turn to God, to turn to light. And you think about, how bright is the light of God? Brighter than the sun. Brighter than our reference point, right? Then, he says that they may receive forgiveness of sins. You mean forgiveness is possible? Yeah, because of a resurrection. He says, and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. Sanctified, that's how you become a saint. And it has to deal with a faith response. So, you see what's put in place. We'll quickly read 19 through 23, but we won't cover it all. We'll come back next week to hit it. He says, so King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision. So I did what I was told. He says, wouldn't you? He says, but kept declaring both to those of Damascus first and also at Jerusalem and then throughout all the region of Judea and even to the Gentiles that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. He says, for this reason, some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to put me to death. He says, for what I was doing out of what Jesus told me to do, because he is still alive, he says, I was obedient, and then I came into the temple to not do anything to stir it up. He says, and that's when I got arrested. And that's why I'm here. Because then verse 22, so having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place. And you know the prophets, and you know Moses, in terms of what was written, that the Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. You talk about, I wonder if Agrippa's head is not just spinning. But you'll find out here in a minute, we're not going to keep on going. But instead, Agrippa goes, I'm not the crazy one, you're the crazy one. You're the one who's out of your mind. So, as you see what's here, you understand Paul's about to turn it to where now it's going to come right at Agrippa. And he gave the reason. I know why I'm here. He says, I know the resurrection. I know that Jesus is raised from the dead. You may not be able to investigate it and find it out, but I know it and I can tell you by experience. And you go, wow, that's something. So you see what's at hand and really what's being put forward here in front of King Agrippa and his sister Bernice, as well as all these prominent men. So Lord willing, next week we'll come back and we'll start in verse 19, and we'll make some ties backwards and be able to kind of move forward and hopefully get through the rest of chapter 26. All right. Have a good week.